Scientists just cracked open the DNA of ancient Aztec skeletons, and what they found inside those bones completely rewrites everything you thought you knew about who the Aztecs really were, where they came from, and how long humans have actually been living in the Americas. And here is the part that nobody in mainstream media wants to talk about. The data points directly back to a question that has haunted archaeologists for decades. Was there a civilization so ancient, so advanced, and so completely erased from history that we are only now, in 2026, beginning to find the fingerprints it left behind inside our own DNA? In April of 2026, one of the most important genetic studies ever conducted on the indigenous people of the Americas was published in the journal Nature. This was not a small study. Scientists from the Institute of Evolutionary Biology, working alongside researchers from the University of São Paulo and Arizona State University, analyzed 199 genomes pulled from indigenous populations spanning the entire length of the Americas, from the frozen north of Canada all the way down to the tip of Patagonia. 128 of those genomes had never been published before in any scientific database ever. The dataset they built was the single largest collection of indigenous American genetic information in the history of science, and what it revealed was extraordinary. First, the basics. The study confirmed that the ancestors of all native peoples of the Americas, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Cherokee, the Inca, every single group, descended from people who crossed into the Americas from Asia roughly 15,000 years ago. That part was expected. But then the data started showing things that nobody was prepared for. The scientists identified not one, not two, but three separate major waves of migration into South America and the Caribbean. The first two were already known, vaguely, but this study tracked them with surgical precision. The third wave, however, was a complete surprise. It happened approximately 300 years ago, and it originated in Mesoamerica, the region we now know as Mexico and Central America. This means that the same cultural zone that produced the Aztecs also sent waves of people south into South America and into the Caribbean islands, leaving a genetic signature that scientists can now read like a map. The Aztecs were not isolated. Their ancestors were moving, connecting, spreading, weaving themselves into the genetic fabric of two entire continents thousands of years before any European ever set foot on American soil. But here is where it gets deeply strange. The study also found something that has no clean explanation. A portion of the DNA, roughly 2% of the genome in certain South American indigenous populations, shows a clear genetic connection to people in Australasia. We are talking about genetic affinity with populations in Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. Not Europe, not Africa. Australia and New Guinea. The scientists named this mysterious ancestral signal Ipiquera, which means ancestor in the indigenous Tupi language of Brazil. This genetic signal has been present in indigenous South Americans for more than 10,000 years, sitting quietly inside their DNA for generation after generation. And here is the mind-bending part. No fossil evidence of this Ipiquera population has ever been found. Scientists are calling it a ghost lineage, an ancient group of humans who contributed their DNA to the earliest Americans, but who left no bones, no tools, no sites that we have discovered yet. They were here, their genes prove it, and yet we cannot find a single physical trace of them. Think about that for a moment. A group of humans whose very existence we only know about because of the faint echo they left inside the DNA of people who are alive today. Their civilization, their culture, their entire story, gone. Completely erased. The only proof they ever existed lives in the genomes of indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest. Now let's talk about the Aztecs specifically, because the DNA story of the Mexica, which is what the Aztecs called themselves, is genuinely one of the most fascinating things scientists have uncovered in recent years. The Aztecs told a story about themselves. They said they came from a mythical homeland in the north called Aztlan. The name Aztec literally comes from this story. Azteca means people of Aztlan. According to their own tradition, they were one of 7 groups who made a long migration southward over many generations before finally arriving in the Valley of Mexico, where they built their legendary island city of Tenochtitlan in 1325 AD. Modern historians long treated this origin story as myth, a kind of founding legend with no more historical accuracy than the stories of Romulus and Remus founding Rome. But the DNA is now telling a different story. Ancient DNA extracted from Aztec skeletons and the skeletal remains of people living in and around the Aztec Empire shows a direct, unbroken genetic connection to the earliest people in the region. When scientists analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic information passed only through the female line, pulled from ancient bones in Mesoamerica, it matches in haplogroup after haplogroup with modern indigenous communities. This means the maternal lineages of the ancient Aztecs have survived. They were not replaced by outsiders. The biological daughters of ancient Mesoamerica became the mothers of the Aztec Empire, and their descendants are alive today. There is continuity stretching across thousands of years, written in the DNA of human bone. But when we look at what happened after the Aztec Empire began expanding in the 1400s, the DNA reveals something darker. Scientists who studied ancient remains from a pre-Aztec city called Xaltecan found that the genetic makeup of the population changed dramatically after the Aztecs conquered the city around 1435 AD. Before the conquest, the residents showed one set of mitochondrial DNA haplogroups. After the conquest, the haplogroups were statistically different. So different that the researchers concluded the matrilines, the female bloodlines of the households, had been replaced following the Aztec takeover. This is genetic evidence of what conquest actually does to a population. The Aztecs were not just a political force, they were a biological reshaping of the ancient Mexican world. Now here's where the story takes a turn that will either fascinate you completely or keep you up at night. The 2026 Nature study found something that the researchers described as a far more complex evolutionary history than previously assumed. The genetic continuity they discovered in some regions stretches back more than 9,000 years. Let that number sink in. 9,000 years of genetic stability in certain indigenous communities. That means the ancestors of the Aztecs were in Mesoamerica at least 9,000 years ago, probably far longer. They were not being replaced or overwhelmed by outside migrations. They were staying put, building, developing, passing their genes, and presumably their knowledge, their astronomy, their agriculture, their architectural traditions, down through generation after generation in an unbroken chain. And then there is the ghost lineage, the Ipiquera signal, that mysterious DNA connection linking early South Americans to populations in Australia and New Guinea more than 10,000 years ago. The mainstream explanation is that there was some ancient, unsampled Asian population that crossed into the Americas by a route we have not yet discovered, carrying genes that also turned up in the ancestors of Australasian peoples. That is a polite way of saying we have no idea how people with genetic ties to Australia ended up deep in South America 10,000 years ago and then completely vanished from the archaeological record. No boats we know of, no migration route we have identified, no campsites, no skeletons, just DNA, just the ghost. Now, in August of 2025, a team of 25 scientists published a landmark paper in the peer-reviewed journal Airbursts and Cratering Impacts. They had found something in Louisiana. Out in the wilderness near the small town of Perkins, there was a depression in the earth, a circular feature roughly 984 feet long that did not look natural. When they started testing the soil inside and around this depression, they found three things that scientists only find in one very specific kind of geological event. They found shocked quartz crystals deformed by extreme pressure that can only be produced by a cosmic impact or a nuclear explosion. They found melted glass, silica that had been flash heated to temperatures no natural geological process in that region could produce. And they found rare metallic spherules, tiny balls of metal that form when material is vaporized by extreme heat and then cools rapidly as it falls through the air. Using radiometric dating and electron microscopy, the researchers confirmed the age of these materials. The event that created them happened 12,800 years ago, almost exactly. And that date, 12,800 years ago, lines up precisely with one of the most dramatic and mysterious transitions in Earth's climate history. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas boundary. It was a moment when the planet, which had been slowly warming out of the last ice age, suddenly reversed course and plunged back into near glacial conditions. Global temperatures dropped by roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It lasted about 200 years. The woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed cat, the giant ground sloth, dozens of species of large animals, went extinct during this window of sudden, catastrophic cold. And multiple cultures of early humans across North America simply stopped, as if wiped from the page. The Louisiana site appears to be the first physically confirmed airburst crater associated with this event. Not an impact crater in the traditional sense, the object never hit the ground. It detonated in the atmosphere above Louisiana with, according to the researchers, a force equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs simultaneously exploding in the sky. The shockwave hit the ground with enough energy to leave a 984-foot depression that is still visible today, 12,800 years later. The airburst left no traditional crater because it never struck Earth, just like the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, which destroyed 830 square miles of forest without leaving a classic impact crater. But unlike Tunguska, which scientists estimate was around 50 megatons of TNT, the Louisiana event appears to have been orders of magnitude larger. And in early 2026, a second major study came out. This one was led by Dr. Christopher Moore from the University of South Carolina, published in the journal PLOS-1. His team went to Baffin Bay near Greenland and pulled core samples of ancient ocean floor mud. They used electron microscopy, energy dispersive spectroscopy, and laser ablation mass spectrometry. some of the most powerful analytical tools available to modern science, to analyze mud layers that had been sitting undisturbed on the ocean floor since 12,800 years ago. What they found in those layers was comet dust, actual geochemical signatures of extraterrestrial material, microscopic particles containing high concentrations of iridium, platinum, cobalt, and nickel, elements that are rare on Earth's surface but found in abundance in comets and asteroids. The chemical fingerprint of material that came from space. Dr. Vladimir Solomovich, one of the authors of the study, said it directly. He said collisions of the Earth with comets led to catastrophes that caused climate change and the death of civilizations. One of these events, he said, was a catastrophe that occurred about 12,800 years ago, the death of civilizations. Now think about all of these discoveries together. A 2026 Nature study revealing that Indigenous Americans carry the genetic signature of a ghost population whose physical remains have never been found. Genetic continuity in the Americas stretching back more than 9,000 years, showing these people were not newcomers but ancient inhabitants. A DNA connection between early South Americans and Australasian populations that nobody can explain through any known migration route. A confirmed cosmic airburst site in Louisiana dated to exactly 12,800 years ago with the explosive force of a nuclear arsenal. And ocean floor sediments in Greenland containing extraterrestrial chemical signatures from that exact same moment in history. What we are assembling here is not a conspiracy theory. These are peer-reviewed, published, scientifically verified discoveries, and together they are painting a picture that mainstream archaeology has resisted for decades. Something catastrophic happened 12,800 years ago. The geological record is unambiguous. A comet, or most likely a fragmented comet, a shotgun blast of space rocks hitting the Earth from multiple directions, triggered a sudden climate disaster. The Younger Dryas cold snap killed off the megafauna. It wiped out or severely disrupted early human cultures across North America. And it happened at precisely the moment when human populations appear to have been building complexity in the Americas. Not cave painting complexity, real complexity. Social systems, trade networks, astronomical knowledge, evidence of organized settlement patterns that go back further than anyone in mainstream science has been comfortable acknowledging. And here's the thing about the ghost lineage, the Ipiquera. If these people existed in the Americas more than 10,000 years ago, if they had genetic ties to populations in Australia and New Guinea, if they spread across the Western Hemisphere and left their DNA in populations from the Amazon to the Caribbean, and yet left no physical archaeological trace, what does that tell you? Either they were so technologically primitive that they left absolutely nothing behind despite spreading across 2 continents and surviving for thousands of years, or something erased them so completely that we simply have not found their sites yet. The DNA survived inside human bodies that kept it alive for 10,000 years, but their tools, their buildings, their cities, if they had any, may be somewhere we have not looked, at the bottom of the ocean, under the sediment of ancient riverbeds, beneath the rainforest floor of the Amazon, 95% of which has never been archaeologically surveyed. Scientists confirmed in the same 2026 Nature study that European colonization decimated indigenous American populations by 90%. 90%. The biological diversity that existed in the Americas before 1492 was not just reduced, it was catastrophically shattered. Whatever knowledge, oral tradition, or cultural memory those populations carried was largely destroyed in a few generations of epidemic disease, forced conversion, and deliberate cultural erasure. The ghost lineage had already been genetically silent for thousands of years before Columbus arrived, but the broader destruction of indigenous knowledge in the colonial period means we lost the human record keepers who might have remembered things in their stories and ceremonies that pointed back to that ancient world. The Aztecs themselves remembered something. They called it Aztlan. They said it was a place in the north, a legendary homeland, and that their ancestors came from there on a long migration. Aztec mythology also refers to Tamoanchin, described as the legendary origin of all civilizations. Not just the Aztec civilization, all of them. A single mythological source point from which everything in Mesoamerican culture descended. Multiple ancient Mesoamerican traditions pointed to an original homeland, an original people, an original moment of creation that preceded everything they knew about themselves. The DNA now shows that they were not entirely wrong. The genetic continuity the 2026 study identified, 9,000 years of biological stability in some Mesoamerican regions, means the ancestors of the Aztecs were in that part of the world at the end of the last ice age. They survived whatever happened 12,800 years ago. They or their close relatives carried the genetic ghost of the Yepiquera population. And they passed those genes, that continuity, forward through hundreds of generations until those genes showed up in the skeletons that archaeologists pulled from Aztec burial sites and sent to laboratories for analysis There's also this. The 2026 genome study identified over 1 million previously unknown genetic variants in indigenous American populations. 1 million new pieces of biological information that science did not know existed before this study. That alone should tell you how little we actually know about the deep history of the Americas. We have been working with an incomplete picture for a very long time, and the picture is now getting sharper. Every new layer we peel back reveals more complexity, more depth, more evidence of a human story in the Americas that is older and more intricate than the textbooks have ever acknowledged. The Aztec DNA is not an isolated piece of evidence. It is one thread in a web. Connect it to the Louisiana airburst crater. Connect that to the Baffin Bay ocean sediments containing comet dust. Connect those to the ghost lineage DNA that links South American indigenous people to ancient Australasians. Connect all of that to the genetic continuity showing 9,000 years of biological stability in Mesoamerica. Connect it to the 3 migration waves, the third of which was Mesoamerican in origin, and spread south to 300 years ago, shaping the genetics of the Caribbean and South America. Connect it to the fact that 90% of the Amazon remains archaeologically unexamined. Connect it to the fact that sea levels were 400 feet lower at the end of the last ice age, meaning entire coastal civilizations would now be sitting under 400 feet of ocean. You do not have to believe in Atlantis to see what the data is saying. The data is saying that the human story in the Americas is far older, far more connected, and far more dramatically disrupted than mainstream science has told us. The data is saying that a cosmic catastrophe happened 12,800 years ago, and that it was real, physically confirmed, and devastating. The data is saying that ghost populations, people who left genetic traces but no physical archaeological sites yet discovered, were present in the Americas more than 10,000 years ago with unexplained ties to people on the other side of the planet. And the data is saying that the Aztecs, far from being a late-arriving empire that sprang from nothing in the 1300s AD, were the cultural and biological descendants of people who had been rooted in Mesoamerica for thousands upon thousands of years before Tenochtitlan was ever built. The mainstream view has been that everything before the pyramids was basically just people slowly getting better at making stone tools. The DNA of the Aztecs is now challenging that story in ways that get harder to dismiss with every new study published. What was the Yipiquera? Why has no fossil evidence of them been found? How did their genes get into South America 10,000 years ago through a route nobody can trace? What happened to the cultures that were thriving in North and South America when a fragmented comet turned the sky into fire 12,800 years ago? What knowledge did they carry that their descendants, the survivors, tried to rebuild in the form of pyramids and astronomy and complex calendar systems? Why did civilizations on opposite sides of the planet, Egypt, Mesoamerica, Southeast Asia, independently develop pyramids, solar calendars, and almost identical mathematical systems with zero contact with each other? The DNA does not answer all of these questions, but it is answering more of them than scientists expected, and every answer leads to 3 more questions. The Aztecs were not a mystery solved. They were a doorway that, when the DNA finally opened it, revealed a corridor stretching back into a darkness so deep that we are only now beginning to see its shape. The story is not over. It is barely beginning. And the bones of the ancient dead, with their microscopic spirals of genetic information still intact after thousands of years, are the ones doing the talking. We just have to be willing to listen to what they are actually saying. But let's go back to the Aztecs one more time, because there is one specific detail in the DNA record that deserves far more attention than it has received. When scientists analyzed the ancient mitochondrial DNA from Aztec-era skeletons, the DNA passed down exclusively through the female line, mother to daughter, generation after generation, they found something remarkable. The haplogroups they identified in those ancient Aztec bones matched directly to haplogroups found in modern indigenous populations across North, Central, and South America. These are not minor statistical overlaps. They are direct matches. The mitochondrial signatures of women who lived inside the Aztec Empire are the same mitochondrial signatures carried by indigenous people alive on this planet right now. The biological mothers of the Aztec world did not disappear. They survived the Spanish conquest, survived the epidemics that killed 9 out of every 10 indigenous people, and their daughters are still here, still carrying the mitochondrial record of everything their ancestors knew and everything their ancestors survived. When you understand that, the Aztec story shifts completely. It stops being a story about a civilization that rose and fell and was replaced. It becomes a story about an unbroken human thread, a genetic lifeline that reaches back past the Aztecs, past the Olmec, past the earliest pottery and the earliest agriculture, all the way to the first humans who walked into Mesoamerica from the north at the end of the last ice age. And then, if the ghost lineage data is correct, possibly even further back than that, to people who were connected to ancient Australasian populations in ways we cannot yet explain. Think about what the Aztecs built. They built Tenochtitlan, a city on an island in the middle of a lake connected to the mainland by massive causeways, home to hundreds of thousands of people with aqueducts carrying fresh water, organized markets, a complex judicial system, mandatory public education, and a calendar system so accurate it tracked the movements of Venus with less than a 1-minute annual error. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1519 were stunned. Several of them wrote that they had never seen anything like it, that the city was more magnificent than any in Europe at the time. And all of that, every stone, every calculation, every engineering solution, was built by people whose DNA now shows a genetic continuity stretching back thousands of years into the American past. They did not build Tenochtitlan from nothing. They built it from the accumulated knowledge of countless generations of ancestors who had been developing, experimenting, observing, and passing down information across the entire span of human civilization in the Americas. That accumulated knowledge is what the DNA is pointing toward. Not necessarily a single advanced civilization that was wiped out by a comet. Maybe something more subtle than that. Maybe a long, slow, continuous process of human development in the Americas that was set back catastrophically 12 to 800 years ago, spent thousands of years recovering, and then began its visible rise again in the form of the Olmec, the Maya, Teotihuacan, the Toltec, and finally the Aztec. The genetics show that people were always there. They never left. They were not replaced. They endured. And in their DNA, in the haplogroups and the ghost lineage signals and the Australasian genetic connections, they left a record of a past so deep it will take decades more of science to fully read. That is the real shock hidden inside the Aztec DNA story. It is not just about the Aztecs. It is about us, about how much of human history is still buried, still underwater, still locked inside bones that no one has yet found, still encoded in genetic sequences we are only beginning to know how to interpret. Every assumption we have made about the timeline of human civilization in the Americas has been based on what we have found. But the DNA is now proving unambiguously that what we have found is a fraction of what is actually there. The genetic diversity revealed by the 2026 study alone, over 1 million previously unknown genetic variants, is proof that indigenous American populations were vastly more complex, more numerous, and more ancient than our archaeological record currently reflects. 1 million unknown variants. 1 million pieces of human biological information that science did not know existed until this year. And that is just from 199 genomes across 53 populations. There are hundreds of indigenous communities across the Americas whose genomes have not been analyzed yet. The picture we have right now is a thumbnail. The full image, when science finally assembles it, is going to change everything we think we know about human history on this planet. The Aztecs asked their gods where they came from. Their gods told them Aztlan. Their genes are now saying something else. Something older, stranger, and more connected across space and time than any origin myth has managed to capture. The answer is still being decoded, but the bones are talking, and the science, for the first time in a very long time, is finally listening.